Welcome to Shattering Myths, the program devoted to those of you who have come to realize, or at least open to the realization, that all of the world's religious, political, economic, military, and media institutions are corrupt, that they are counterproductive. I am Yahowah. Our number, if you'd like to join us anytime over the next 2 hours, is toll-free, 877-300-7645. I want to tell you 2 stories today, report on 2 events in the news, and then transition from there to some insights that I think might be helpful. I think these 2 stories are connected, even though they are on different places of the globe. I think they reveal the same problem and thus the same opportunity. The first occurred in Stillwater over the weekend. It was a Saturday afternoon in Oklahoma and in Texas. Football is part of the fabric of those societies, and therefore somewhere between 50 and 100,000 people would line the streets and join in a parade that was part of homecoming to celebrate the Oklahoma State Cowboy football program. And as they were out there, a woman who was, according to police, under the influence, not only slammed her car into the crowd, wounded seriously some 40 people, of which many were women and children, some as young as infants. But she accelerated after going through a barricade and after ramming through a police motorcycle. The video shows her accelerating. Her lawyer spoke this morning and was actually a fairly straight-up fellow. He said that he had talked to her the evening of and he didn't call it an accident, he called it an incident. And he said that based upon the questions that he asked and the statements that he made, that he was of the impression, if not conclusion, that while she may have been under the influence of something, and that could have been prescription drugs, that she was incompetent, mentally ill. And the reason I bring this up is that we as a society have made the decision in America to mainstream the mentally ill and the mentally handicapped, even the physically handicapped. And while there is evidence that the institutions, the human institutions in which they were forcibly kept, were inhuman, that they were perverted, that the care was often abusive, and that the individuals therein were deprived of their freedom, and that many therein committed no crimes, but there is a direct consequence of mainstreaming those whose judgment is incapacitated, particularly in a society where exercising good judgment has been at odds with the nationalized religion of political correctness of socialist secular humanism. So in a society that already fails to exercise good judgment, those whose judgment is impaired, being mainstreamed has a consequence. Virtually all of the mass shootings in America are the direct result of someone being mentally ill and have been treated by a psychiatrist or psychologist and prescribed mind-altering drugs. Legal mind-altering drugs. I'm sure that some of those drugs help people cope. But there are consequences of those drugs, and there are consequences of mainstreaming such individuals. What we witnessed in Stillwater, with the death of 4 individuals, one 23 years old, one 2 years old, and the maiming of so many others, is a direct consequence of that choice. We ought not blame the automobile. Similarly, to blame a gun for the mass shooting deaths in schools is akin to saying a hammer and saw are responsible for a home. No. What's responsible for a home is developers, builders, subcontractors, craftsmen, banks, and the families that desire raising their families in them. That is what creates a home. It isn't the saw, it isn't the hammer, just as it isn't the gun nor the bullets that are responsible for mass killings. We as a society have lost the ability to connect things, to associate things, to find the common denominator, to transition from information to understanding. And in this regard, we almost always make the wrong decision. We almost always form errant opinions. We are extraordinarily easily misled. We are all too easily played for fools and indoctrinated into an errant understanding. Now I'd like to transition from that to the statements of one Tony Blair. Tony Blair is somewhat famous today for doing something that I have spoken of now for many, many, many years. In fact, I would say it would be fair to say that I have spoken of this now for better part of 15 years. He admitted that it would be inappropriate not to hold those who sought to kill Saddam Hussein accountable for the Islamic State. That was a double negative, and he didn't blame himself. He didn't accept responsibility. He says, there's a case can be made. There is some truth to the statement that our invasion of Iraq and deposing of Saddam Hussein has in part contributed to the rise of the Islamic State. Now, he would go on to say, but that doesn't mean that I would ever go to the point where I'd say that removing Saddam Hussein was the wrong thing to do. Well, the first part of that is absolutely true. But it's not partially true. It's wholly true. And it's amazing that a left-wing socialist secular humanist can finally admit some accountability. And yet no one in America seems capable of it. Not one person. Not George W. Bush, not his vice president, not his national security advisor, Condoleezza Rice, not the head of his CIA or Department of Defense. No one. Not a single person in America, not even Senator John McClown of Arizona, seems capable of acknowledging the obvious, that America's and Great Britain's invasion of Iraq under false pretenses that they had weapons of mass destruction and were about to develop an atomic bomb and that they were harboring al-Qaeda, none of which was true, actually created the conditions that led to the civil war in Iraq and to the formation of the Islamic State. Americans are incapable of being honest, incapable of accepting responsibility, incapable of recognizing their mistakes. But here is a socialist secular humanist in Great Britain that at least is partially accountable. Now, the reality is that he still is incapable of seeing the totality of cause and consequence. He is incapable of viewing the issues in Iraq, in the Islamic world, in context. To say that it is good and that you have no regrets about deciding that the head of another country ought to die and that you ought to participate in their killing, and to not think through the consequence of that in the context of the greater whole is the problem. We recognize that Saddam Hussein, as a dictator, was not an ideal leader. But we didn't recognize that there are no ideal leaders and there are no democracies in the Islamic world, and there never will be. And that Islam is so evil, so prone to terrorism, so deadly, so destructive, so deceitful, that the only thing that keeps it from chaos, from the conditions we are witnessing today in Iraq and Syria and Yemen and Libya and throughout much of the Islamic world, the only thing that keeps it from total anarchy, death, and destruction is an ironclad hand, is someone who deprives people of their freedom, who deprives them of weapons. Saddam Hussein did those things. There was absolutely no presence of al-Qaeda in his midst when he was in control. In fact, he would not tolerate fundamentalist Muslims. Under his control, the Kurds, at least those Kurds that weren't actively trying to overthrow Iraq on behalf of Iran, were able to live. They were not harassed. The same was true with Shia. They didn't have as many rights as they would have liked to have had. Their religion wasn't superior to Sunnis in his Iraq, but they were not mercilessly hunted down by the government. The same was true with Zoroastrians and of Christians. That is not true today. Former British Prime Minister Tony Blair acknowledged the 2003 invasion of Iraq played a part in the rise of the Islamic State militant group and apologized for some mistakes in planning the war. In an interview broadcast on Sunday, asked whether the offensive was the principal cause of the Islamic State, which now controls large areas of Iraq and neighboring Syria, Blair said there were elements of truth in that. Of course, you can't say that those of us who removed Saddam in 2003 bear no responsibility for the situation in 2015, Blair told U.S. network CNN. Critics say the U.S. decision to disband Saddam Hussein's army after the invasion created a huge security vacuum exploited by al-Qaeda, which was eventually replaced by the Islamic State. That's not true. But what is true is that, and this statement is the next in the article, some former Iraqi army officers, members of the Sunni minority, which says it has been marginalized by Shiite-led governments backed by Western powers, are senior strategists in the Islamic State. That's true. It's not completely true, but it's absolutely, but yet it's true. The Islamic State is comprised mostly of the leading Sunnis in Iraq under Saddam Hussein. But it's not just army generals and colonels under Saddam Hussein. It's also the merchants, the bankers. It's the executives of the businesses. It's the government and political leaders of Iraq. It's those who provided the command and control, those who delivered services, those who ran the economy, those who were in positions of leadership. And those are the same individuals that America aided and abetted, armed, and enriched as part of the Awakening program. The Awakening program provided weapons and empowerment to these same individuals who have now become the leaders in the Islamic State. It's a comprehensive reality. And yet, this is the first time I've seen in an article at least some acknowledgement that the Islamic State is comprised of the Sunni leaders in Iraq. And yet I've not seen anyone acknowledge how those senior leaders became armed and empowered, which was during the Awakening program. And it was during that program, when it was first announced by Bush and Petraeus, that I said, this is going to be the consequence. It's exactly what we have seen. And while the Awakening program was allegedly designed to have the Sunnis fight al-Qaeda, there was no al-Qaeda in Iraq, ever. And al-Qaeda, had it been in Iraq, was a Sunni organization. Sunnis aren't going to kill Sunnis. But Sunnis are going to protect themselves from the onslaught of Shia, the very Shia that America empowered in Iraq. We caused the civil war. We armed both sides. We created the conditions and empowered the individuals, providing them with weapons, that created the Islamic State. And so, Tony Blair, George W. Bush, et al., bear 100% of the responsibility, not only for the Islamic State, but for the civil war that is being fought in Iraq and in Syria, that have caused the death of so many people, and the largest migration, the most counterproductive, the most suicidal migration in human history. At least Tony Blair has acknowledged a tiny bit of it. At least the media has recognized one of the most important connections. Now, if only they can think through the whole process. Blair apologized for what he described as mistakes in planning and intelligence. You know, it is. They had a scheme. The scheme was evil. They lacked intelligence. And it's amazing that here's a man that was considered to be among the most intelligent in the world. One that presents himself as a scholar, as an enlightened and elitist. And yet, he was stupid in this regard. He lacked intelligence. The very leaders, the elitists, who claim to be the best and brightest, are neither. So what does it say about the people electing them? Blair said, the Arab Spring uprisings across the region also affected Iraq. That's a lie. There was no Arab Spring. There was an Islamic Reformation. Even in Tunisia. That's how it materialized. The Ennahda Party came into power. It led Muslims, fundamentalist Muslims, into power. It was an Islamic Reformation, one of the most profound changes in our world, where fundamentalist Muslims came into power. And we've seen the terror that has ensued. It did not affect Iraq. What affected Iraq was the invasion of Iraq and the removal of Saddam Hussein, the arming of both sides. To now, what Tony Blair is doing is trying to obfuscate responsibility. He's only conditionally accepted some responsibility. Then Blair apologized, which he said were mistakes, as I said, in planning and intelligence before the war and in preparations for what would happen once Saddam was removed, but said it had been the right decision. You see, even in this tiny morsel of acceptance of responsibility, everything else is foregone. Saddam Hussein was a bad guy. So was Mubarak. So was Muammar Gaddafi. However, they were vastly better than the alternatives. And there was no alternative that could have emerged that would have been better. There was absolutely no chance of a unifying, freeing, liberating, caring, uplifting, positive, enlightened, rational, civil government in any of these countries poisoned as they are by Islam. It would not have happened in 10,000 tries. It would not have happened over the course of 10,000 years. It would not have happened with the spilling of 1 million lives or $100 trillion worth of coin. And when you pursue that which is impossible because of your ignorance of reality, this is what occurs. No, it was an absolute mistake for the world to decide, for Tony Blair and George Bush to decide to kill Saddam Hussein. He says we tried intervention. Yeah, that would be Afghanistan and Iraq, both situations made infinitely worse by our intervention and putting down troops in Iraq. And we tried intervention without putting down troops in Libya. And we tried no intervention at all. Where would that be? Where would that be? Where did you try no intervention at all? Tony? You sure as hell intervened in Syria. The CIA now has acknowledged that. You sure as hell intervened in Yemen. You sure as hell has intervened in Pakistan. Where have you tried not to intervene, Tony? You tried intervention and putting troops down. You tried intervention without putting troops down. You didn't try no intervention at all. And everything that you've tried, Tony, has failed. All but demanding regime change in Syria. Oh, that's where you think, Tony, that you didn't intervene? What in the hell are you doing, Tony? With your bombers, with your cruise missiles, with creating a country so ravaged by war that it has spawned 10 million trying to flee, which you have done, Mr. Blair. It's not clear to me, even if our policy did not work, that subsequent policies would have worked better. Nothing is clear to you, because you don't know what would have worked. You never considered what would have worked, because it's not part of your political religion. What would have worked is the truth, is to expose and condemn Islam based upon Muhammad's words and deeds, based upon the Quran and Hadith, based upon his history and its history. That would have worked. And then to have isolated Islam, to quarantine it. What would have worked is to disengage, to stop providing weapons, to stop intervening, to stop occupying, to stop invading. That's what was not tried. And had you tried that, it would have worked. But we're not capable of thinking these things through. He says, I find it hard to apologize for removing Saddam. You didn't remove him, you killed him. I find it hard to apologize for killing Saddam. And think of the consequence. 1 million people are dead. 20 million are refugees. Tens of thousands of little girls have been kidnapped and turned into sex slaves. The Christians and Zoroastrians have been annihilated in genocidal rage. Tony, as a result of what you did, and yet you find it difficult to apologize. He says even today in 2015, it's better that he's not there than he is there. In what world? There's 20 million refugees, 1 million dead, tens of thousands of little girls now raped every day as sex slaves. All as a direct result. The world inflamed in terrorism. A civil war without end. The migration of the worst disease man has ever conceived throughout Europe. In what world, Tony, is that better? Unless that's what you sought to achieve. And then the thing that's not better is you. We have lost the ability to view things in context. To recognize that just because something is bad does not mean that something else will be better. We've lost the ability to make connections. To recognize that the awakening program led to the Islamic State, and that our invasion of Iraq led to the Sunni-Shia civil war that has engulfed the world of Islam. We have no accountability relative to our nations becoming the merchants of death, of us going in and breaking countries, of the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people that our invasions have killed. There's a complete lack of judgment, a failure to understand cause and consequence. It is the reason why I've come to a point in doing this show where I realize there's nothing more I can say. If you've been influenced by, indoctrinated by, the same disease promoted by Tony Blair, socialist secular humanism and its moral replacement code, political correctness, then there is nothing anyone can do to help you. There is no amount of evidence or reason because you've lost the ability to reason. Evidence rolls off your back like water on a duck. God himself can't reach you. God himself can't help you because you've become immune to exercising good judgment, to making connections, to seeing cause and consequence, to finding the connections between things, to being accountable, to exercise good judgment. There is a proverb, it's a word picture, that is presented that I think addresses these issues and God's frustration with them and those busying themselves making bad situations worse. It was sent to me by William, a gentleman who participates fairly often with our Shabbat program, Yahowah Radio on Blog Talk Radio. And William sent what is something that is from Proverbs 6, beginning right around the 16th verse. And on future programs, I may, when I have time, go in and translate, everything from the beginning of the word picture, the mashal, the proverb, all the way through the 15th verse, and everything after this statement. But this statement is the core of this message. The rest of it does set it in context and therefore is valuable to us, and we will not ignore it. But right now, what I want to do is share with you this word picture. It is the word picture of a father to his children. The father is not an ordinary father. He is the father of the universe, the father of life, the father of humanity, the father of the Torah, the father of the covenant. His name is Yahowah. It begins, behold, henna, presently these, sheth, 6. And it could be 6 things if the way that Hebrew works. So behold, presently, now, at this present time, pay attention, there are 6 things Yahowah hates. Well, that starts off as interesting. The Christian God is a God of love. He is the all-loving. Well, how can he be all-loving if there are 6 things he hates? As a matter of fact, folks, I would tell you that when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians and had this ode to love and said, love never fails, that, if you could only love enough, you could achieve anything, I would tell you you're flat out wrong. God would say you're flat out wrong. He's doing so right here. There are things Yahowah hates because the only way to love is to hate. If you don't hate which is hostile, that which is hostile to what you love, you're not loving. I've said this on numerous occasions, and I want to reemphasize it. If you don't hate that which is hostile to, counterproductive, hurtful to those you love, then you're not actually loving. In this world, we find ourselves constantly berated with the idea that all evil flows out of hate. And I have said, and Yahowah has said, that no, the opposite is true. It is because we do not hate evil that it continues to negatively affect those we love. To love your children, you must hate those who would rape them and sodomize them. To love your children, you must protect them from those who would kidnap or enslave them. To love, you must be willing to hate that which is willing to take their lives, willing to abuse them, willing to take their liberty. If you do not hate that which misleads them, then you aren't a protective, caring, or nurturing parent. The problem in our world isn't that we hate too much, it's that we don't know what to hate, and we don't hate the things that are counterproductive enough. We ought not, as political correctness says, tolerate and accept that which is destructive, that which is counterproductive, that which is deadly and deceitful. We ought to despise it. And here we're finding that there are 6 things that Yahowah says that he himself personally despises, that he abhors, that he hates. And 7 things he's going to say that are an abomination. And we're going to have the opportunity to think through this word picture of what the perfect Father hates, and then think of why he would hate these things. Hello, Kirk.
Morning.
I know that I have been out on a very, very lonely limb with this counterintuitive notion that the problem with our world isn't that we hate, it's that we don't know what to hate, and we hate insufficiently.
Well,
Do you want to crawl out on that limb with me, or saw it off?
No, the comments you just made until recently, I don't know. In my growing up, and I'm getting old now. I'm in my 60s. I don't know of anyone who would have argued with that. They would have said, "Well, of course."
Yeah.
I mean, in the context of someone raping your child, hurting your child, stealing your child, enslaving someone, why would you not go to their defense at any cost?
Right. It's like those the family members of the victims of mass shootings, and they say, we don't hate the perpetrator, we forgive them. That's not God's point of view. You ought to hate them.
Yeah.
This idea that we ought to accept as migrants those who are part of a religion that has annihilated Christians and Zoroastrians and has enslaved and sexually abused little boys and little girls ought not be accepted, but ought to be hated.
I've been waiting for the Christian world to holler for the last 11 years in Iraq as they wiped out 1 million Christians.
Mm-hmm.
I just seem to hear, and they never have in Africa. I mean,
no.
You know, they wiped
what
out.
They've done to the Christians in Pakistan, what they've done to the Christians in Iran, and Iraq, and Syria, and Libya, and Egypt. It's always the same. And now Nigeria with Boko Haram. Well, I do not support Christianity in any way, shape, or form.
No, but
it's astonishing that Christians somehow ignore the fact that they are being annihilated by Muslims in the areas that Muslims have influence, and they don't seem to yet hate Islam. What a twisted, perverted religion that causes someone to accept, to embrace those who perpetrate such evil.
Not sending an army after they picked up all those little girls in Africa was, of all the things that everybody's running off to Africa to save, they just ignored them.
Yeah, why instead of bombing Muammar Gaddafi and turning Libya into a terrorist state, why not send? If we're going to dispatch a military, how much harm could we have done if we dispatched our military and our intelligence assets to free, to retrieve, to spare those little girls that are being gang raped every day by the thousands?